There we go. So good morning, everybody here. Well, it's me, it's Jess, and I'm sitting here with Tara Williamson, my co-facilitator, co-host, and Rebecca Johnson and Val Napoleon. And Rebecca and Val have been the people carrying this intensive methodology, methods, and practice of an Indigenous law course for years. The course was designed by Val Napoleon alongside Hadley Friedland. And this has been the basis of a lot of the work that we do at the Indigenous Law Research Unit. It's so the foundational theoretical inquiries that we do and the methodology and the methods that we engage with at the Indigenous Law Research Unit. So we wanted to start with one of our first observations with these two incredible women whose shoes we're about to attempt to stand in for the length of this course. And what we really wanted, pardon me?
I'm not attempting to stand in.
You're not attempting, yes, there are no attempts. You saw I stuttered through that because I also, it's different, but it's inspired, right? It's inspired by these two incredible people who have been carrying this course for some time. So it makes sense to start with a little conversation with Val, with Rebecca. And what we want to focus on are two of the readings that are in the course pack for this week. They're the Hart and Fuller conversation. Often there's a conversation around the debate and the questions around theories of law and positive law and natural law and questions about internal views of law. And these conversations arise out of the conversations that Hart and Fuller were having. So we thought nobody better than our two legal theorists in our unit focusing a conversation on that. But first, what I'll ask is for Val and to Rebecca to introduce themselves in however form they would like, and also say whatever they want before we have a bit of a conversation around Hart and Fuller. So let's start with Val.
All right, Val Napoleon. I'm from Treaty 8, Saulteaux First Nation in Northeast British Columbia. I'm also an adopted member of the House of Lujan from Gitineau, the Northern Gitxsan. I went to law school when I became a grandmother, so I'm a grandmother. That's about it.
Thanks, Val. Rebecca?
My name is Rebecca Johnson. I come from a line of European settlers who plunged on those waves over to both the US and then Canada in probably the 1700s and eventually settled in southern Alberta. So I was born in Treaty 7 territory there and find myself peeking out my window, looking at how beautiful it is and thinking about what a gift it's been to be here for 20 years now with my two boys, 19 and 21, having this experience of COVID pandemic times, talking to you guys in this format rather than in kind of our usual formats. So I'll start with that.
Thank you. Okay, Tara, I think you're going to ask the first question.
I think that I am. Miigwech, thanks for introducing yourself. Also, I appear to be, it must be a big pollen day because I've already sneezed 3 times. So hopefully I'll just mute myself when that happens. So thinking about Hart and Fuller, I think one of the things that we wanted to just ask from the outset is why are we starting the Indigenous Laws course with 2 old dead white guys? I don't remember the thing. Yeah. Okay. Just, like, maybe they're really.
Yeah. It's a good question. It's one that that people, I think, need to think about. I happen to think that everyone should read legal theory, like JD and JID, and people that are engaging in Indigenous law. One of the things that I've been writing about just recently is the importance of people to be able to connect their experiences, the practices of their lives and their worlds with the big ideas in the world. And those big ideas, like there's many forms of theories, and Hart and Fuller offer some big ideas through which we can grapple with different aspects of understanding law and understanding by extrapolation Indigenous law. Like they both are writing, for the most part, they're writing about state law, and the work that you have to do is to unhinge it from state law and to take those ideas then which are useful to Indigenous law. So it's that the big ideas of the world and our ability to engage in them that I think is critical to all law, not just Indigenous law. The danger of denying theory is that there's no such thing as a world without theory. We all have ideas about how the world works, whether they're visible or invisible, or whether we share them or not, they're there. And if we don't talk about them, and if we don't acknowledge the different kinds of theories that are around us and that we are engaging in and perpetuating, they're invisible. And we need to look at what are the assumptions that we're making about law, what are the assumptions in the way that we think law should be organized or taught or practiced and so on. And so we need the everyday, the experience of the everyday and the practice, but we need to also look at a lot of the different ways that we might better understand the everyday so that we don't get turned into technicians or operate in a way that our power is invisible. So that's part of it. The other, Gordon Woodman, who is a legal anthropologist, legal theorist, whose work is in Africa, in a collection that he put together a long time ago, said, or asked the question, or he pointed out that there was a big debate in Africa about whether the thinking about law and thinking about everything should only be African. And there were those and are those who say anything else from outside of Africa, we shouldn't even consider them. They're inauthentic. They're not useful to us. They're going to take away from who we are. They're going to colonize us. So all of this whole rejection of anything that's not African. And then you have others who are saying, but these ideas, like these theories, political theories, legal theories, economic theories, all this work going on in the world, that's, can we not add our thinking to that? And then it becomes ours. Then we engage with it rather than trying to, can we not become a part of that as opposed to trying to create our own separate road? And I think that, it's obvious one has to be critical in looking at the big ideas of the world. But I also think that a denial of those big ideas is really problematic, and it's really problematic for Indigenous people, just as it is for anyone else.
Yeah, this really reminds me of, as I was looking on my shelves to see if I could find books, one of the challenges that people sometimes hit at this point is one of trying to figure out how to describe what kind of person they are and what their relationship is to theory. And when we do that with Hart and Fuller, there's sort of two kinds of common responses that people might have. One is for people who've been sort of trained in those texts, there's like a great feeling of comfort and of like a return to something that's loved. Then for the people who haven't encountered it, there's often a deep sense of fear or of panic about those texts. And so you have kind of people trying to be in a conversation where there's like deep affection and totalizing fear. So like, it's just to acknowledge that that's a really common thing people might feel. But part of that is also learning how to kind of treat that in the way that you would if you were to imagine both your colleagues in these different places and the texts themselves as your friends and not your enemies. And so I think Joseph Vining, another legal theorist, talks about the importance of your stance in approaching the world as one of friends and not enemies. And it doesn't mean being like completely foolish or foolhardy or, you know, utopian or not taking account of safety, but it means to have an approach where your first questions are curiosity and friendship about the texts and the others, including the different ways that people are approaching these texts. Because if you imagine yourself in a conversation with a friend, then it's a different kind of capacity to be able to both identify your loves for a text that sometimes include limits, or your fears for a text that also includes limits. So there's this stance of friend, not enemy, that can be helpful. And the second piece is to think about the importance of having a tasting mind in these questions and not a judging mind. And this again draws out of J.K. Gibson Graham, which is a collective theorists, two women who wrote together under one common assumed name to kind of think through these problems. And they talk about how it can be really helpful for you to approach theory in this way. So your goal and our goal and their goal, all of our goals in giving theoretical pieces, is to give gifts for engagement. And the goal isn't for you to have mastery of the text, like to have the authoritative interpretation of Hart or Dworkin or Rawls, or in fact, to be in debates about if you even should read them or should they be evacuated or kicked out. So the goal is instead to have a tasting mind, which is to say, what can I learn from this text, or what questions can this text just help me think about, where my goal is just, you know, touch your tongue on the edge of that thing. You can have a lifetime of an engagement with a text, but here it's just to taste, and you're thinking about the question, these are friends and they're coming to sit with you, and you get to kind of ask them a question or tell them a thing, or see if there's something in that that can help you think about questions that are going to link people across eons of human time. And you don't have to be afraid of that. You just want to taste, and the taste you have will be adequate and enough for the place that you're at. You'll come back to these things, you'll taste them again.
The other thing is to not assume that Indigenous peoples didn't have our own theorists. I mean, you know, one of the examples that I like to use is the slide that came down Sticky Odin, just near Hazelton, the mountain near Hazelton. So, you know, that was one of the pieces of evidence in Delgamuukw. And so the way that people talked about that slide was as a giant grizzly bear that came down the mountain. So these were Giksan, and then it was, you know, verified by the court that there was a slide 300 years ago and so on. So these are Giksan people making sense of the world and theorizing about their world according to their cosmology, according to their relationships to the land, and everything else in it. So we, Indigenous people, theorize. The problem is we don't have libraries and books full of those theories. A lot of what's now thought about as Indigenous theory is quite philosophical and not necessarily that helpful to some of the critical questions that need to be asked about law. So, oh God. The result is that the way we're working with the intellectual resources from different legal traditions is we draw on the narratives, the oral histories, the stories, and so on. And then we theorize, right? Because that hasn't been done. Indigenous peoples haven't There's not yet enough body of work of Indigenous people creating those theoretical resources for us to be able to draw on. Like all of that was part of the shattering of colonization, was that our intellectualism, our public intellectualism, our thinking, our intellectual legal, our intellectual traditions in and of themselves, all of that was undermined as a part of that colonization. What we're doing when we talk about rebuilding law, it's not just the practices of law or parts of law or the structure, institutions, or organization of law. It's the pedagogies, it's the thinking, it's the creativity and the critique that our minds need to bring to the tasks, to solving the problems that our peoples are facing. And law is one way to do that. It's not the only way, but it's one way. And yes, it's hard work, but so what? Indigenous people are up to that. They should be up to that. Our ancestors were, and there's no darn reason why we shouldn't be today.
The question of what a rebuilding looks like, I sometimes, when Val's talking about things like that, I think about the work of learning an instrument or playing the piano or substitute the guitar, the harmonica, the paintbrush, whatever place in the world, the garden, wherever a sport, whatever you kind of put yourself into. But the joy of that stuff, the beauty of that stuff is in the learning how to have the mastery of the instrument so that the instrument can play. And you can have books in the bookshelf full of scores of music, right, that's there. You can have those musical pieces then put into performance, but there's also musicality. And so when we talk about why it matters to think about yourself now as legal theorists engage in the work of building your capacities to be able to work with Indigenous legal resources, it helps to think about this as a form of practice where you don't get stopped by the question of if you've done the scales right, or if you've got the right or the wrong interpretation of the score. Part of this is learning how to develop the capacities to work with the material. So there'll be other questions about what are authoritative interpreters or when are the appropriate contexts for certain kinds of interpretations, because all law is thick and fulsome, Indigenous and others. And all legal orders can confront log jams and blockages when they tend to start to place the weight of law in the texts and not in the instrument. So this is equally true in common law, that the point of this is not for you to have the right interpretation of Hart. The point of this is for you to engage in conversation about how to learn and how to work with the resources to kind of see into what people were thinking and to draw them back out into the present. So it's this spirit of engagement that can be really helpful for you in turning your encounters with these texts into things that come alive for you so that they can be returned to in conversation to help you have strengths and capacities now in the world to do the hard work of law now. Right? With problems that were then and were before, and that's one of the amazing things in many of the Indigenous legal resources that you'll look at, is that you can see that they're embedded in a long trajectory where the problems, that the challenges that are described in those accounts are human problems that go beyond Hart and Fuller, but we're going to sometimes look at Hart and Fuller or Maria Campbell or Neil Starrett or John or Val or artists or singers as thinkers, right?
It was such a rich conversation. I feel like you've actually touched on a bunch of the subsequent questions, but just sort of reflecting back a little bit, that idea of, I really liked Val when you talked about not becoming a technician, right? That's sort of like speaking to that idea of it's almost a sense of dogma, right? So not being a technician, but needing the practice, needing to actually be practiced with it, right? But the goal is, in fact, I love that you talk about artistry, right? That the goal is when we think about theory, we think about theorists, it's not about getting it right. it's not about this one matches, you know, this theorist or theory matches to this issue or problem, or it's you engage with it with all the different ways that you can, and then you create, and it's just that constant back and forth of engaging and creating and revisiting and revising. And anyway, so thank you. That was wonderful. Jess, do you want to assess if you would like to ask another question? They really did touch on.
What were the other questions?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I think so, because like in the spirit of like, why can't we add, or why can't we taste, or why don't we engage? Like, what is it about Hart and Fuller and what they're thinking about that's really important for the work that we're doing today? Like, what is it about their theories of law that relate to Indigenous law revitalization, if we can go to the specific?
So, I mean, they both have written many things. If you look at, you know, what Hart talks about with primary and secondary rules, for instance, I think that we have lots of examples where Indigenous law is being described as only being primary rules, okay? And so then people don't have any way to get there. And the problem that so many slide into, and actually one of the things that Julie Cruikshank touches on in her work is the danger of conflating norms with behaviors. So if you just have primary rules and you don't have a way to get there, that's the tendency to do that conflation. And that's the book that Rebecca is holding up there. That's one of her wonderful pieces of work that, I mean, initially when I first started working with Indigenous law way back in the day, that was a really important resource for me. So so then we can think about like Hart and Fuller, primary, secondary rules, and what are the secondary rules? And he basically sets out three bodies. One is that there has to be a way for people to agree on what the rules are, right? Number one, people, and that's a collective process. So that what is the law? How do people know it's the law? How do they agree that it's the law? And then people have to know what to do when the law is broken. And this is why it's problematic when people just declare the law, when people just say, this is the law, and you're a good person if you follow the law and a bad person if you don't. But how do you know if you don't? Like what we know from Canadian law, there's all kinds of variations. Like do you, when you're talking about child sexual abuse, how do you have to think differently about an issue if it's a 15-year-old FAS kid who sexually assaulted a 3-year-old? You can't just think about it the same way as you would every other situation. Like, so you know, that idea of how do you know when the law is broken requires that you look at context, requires that you look at the problem, requires that you exercise judgment and reason in how you engage with the law. And then finally, how do you know when the law has changed, and how do you change the law? So again, that requires processes of legitimacy. People have to agree, otherwise they're not going to uphold the law. And that's always the challenge, is people upholding the law, even when they don't get their own way. So what are the processes that allow people to do that? So, I mean, that in a nutshell, that's part of what Hart sets out. It's pretty, it's really useful. It's a really useful approach for thinking about Indigenous law. It's not the only thing. I mean, the problem with Hart and any other theorist is that there's so much that he takes for granted, right? That he doesn't have to explain. And so then we have to pay attention to what isn't he explaining. So Richard Overstall took a crack at trying to articulate that which is left out by the primary and secondary rule approach. And what he said is that there's a third category of law, which is constitutional. And it's those foundational laws for Giksan that tie them to land, that forms the basis from which they that the basis that they're of who they are, that the law that they've built reflects. And so, I mean, that's a useful thing, but so it's just a caution. Like when we're looking at these theorists, what are they leaving out? What are the assumptions that they have? What can I take? How am I informing them? What are my assumptions, and so on? And with Fuller, there's there's Fuller's interaction law as interaction, which has been really useful for thinking about law beyond the state. And I mean, there's other theorists who've really helpfully worked with these ideas, but it's that idea that our general understanding and of what we can expect from one another on a large scale, like how we treat one another, those interactions over time create another form of law that derives from human experience, derives from human behavior and interaction, and that we can learn from that. So that's non-state law. So that was a really helpful idea, because, if you only think, because there's so many very rigid ideas out there about law legitimately only coming from the state. The other parts of Fuller's work have to do with King Rex, and he set out 8 conditions by which that were required for law to be possible. It's not quite how he phrases it, and so those those are legalities that he says are necessary in order for law to be law. And he says a lot more about that. But if you just take that sort of basic idea of what is he doing? Like, what's he doing? So how might that be helpful for us as Indigenous people to start asking, how do we know this is law? Because, I worry sometimes when people are describing particular ordering or authority in a way that sounds like a dictatorship. Is that law? Where are the tools by which we can think about that a bit more carefully? Where are the standards by which we're going to look at what we call law, what we understand as law, and if it's oppressive, then how do we change it? We need that ability to assess, and that's actually one of the things that's important about theory. It's in the big ideas about law that you can look at the contradictions, you can look at its failures, you can look at the problems of it in the bigger picture, which then can inform the specifics in the practice. But if you only look at the specifics in the practice, you're not necessarily going to see that something is really oppressive to other people, to genders, and so on. So that's another aspect of drawing on somebody like Fuller. What I would like to see, what I hope will happen, is for Indigenous peoples to develop enough of a body of work to then take Fuller's legalities and apply them. Draw on Kirsten Rundle's work, and where, she argues that what's key in Fuller's work is actually the relationships through which authority is understood and acted on, and to take these work and develop, what are our standards? What are our legalities for Indigenous societies, for Indigenous law? And similarly with, to draw on Hart and other theorists, because there's lots of amazing theorists. We need to take it all, and we need to have our way with it according to our terms. That's the goal.
There's there's on the artists front. So Michael Snow, that some of you from sort of may or may not know, but he did the geese in the Eaton Center. There's a legal case where somebody came and then put Christmas bows on those Canada geese, and he sued them for interrupting his artwork. So Michael Snow has this statement where he describes his art practice. And I think it's useful for thinking about your legal practice in engaging with this theoretical material. And what he said, I would go get the t-shirt, but the t-shirt material, I make up the rules of a game and then I attempt to play it. If I seem to be losing, I change the rules. So I think in that you've got a couple of things in a playful and possibly dictatorial way, because he's only talking about himself. But it gets us to some of these questions, like rules actually help you play the game. So what would it be to have a set of rules that enable you to play the game? But you can't even know if you're going to win or lose, or if the rules are going to be right until those rules are in practice and they're being played. And then it's in the playtime that you have the opportunity to go back and think about the question of those rule changes. You know, he has full authority. Different questions if you're playing a game with multiple people. But it's, I guess my point is, theory is present in everything around you all the time. So when you're going to the texts, if you're thinking only about these texts in terms of their correctness or not, or the accuracy of what they describe, then it's that's open to you. But there's something really useful in having an approach that allows you to go to them to find, again, what's in the best of them. So if you go to Fuller's, the sort of 8 legalities with your mind only within analytic philosophical kind of approach, which nothing wrong with the analytic philosophers. But if your goal is to say, is it correct? Then you have a different standard than if you go in and say, what can we learn by noticing when parts of these legalities are feeling compromised? And that is what is going to open the conversation for people from different places to translate their experiences through the categories, to kind of work together to see these things, the challenges, the problems, what rebuilding is necessary. But it's going to take many eyes on the problem, many tastes, and many conversations about the different languages that you might use to describe what feels uncomfortable. So in your readings, I'd also encourage you to take seriously the parts that feel uncomfortable, but not just stop at them or assume that they're wrong or something's off in it, but to take that discomfort as a productive site for conversation, to think about, how does this sound if you articulate it in the language that you're more comfortable with, and how can it help you share with your colleagues examples of where and why you think what you can see in your own life that these things can help you carry forward. Yeah.
Thank you. There's so much just within the conversation we've had now for students to dig into these theory readings and really really start seeing them as invitations, seeing them as friends, and seeing how they can have their way with them in their own work or in their I returning to these again before we had this conversation, I was, there were times when I wanted to throw Hart across the room, because I was thinking, you're just not seeing it. You're just not seeing it. You're saying all these things about secondary rules that they're not, but you just haven't done the work of understanding something from a different framework, which is what Val is touching on in terms of what are the assumptions underlying things. But I'm also reminded that, yeah, not so long ago, I didn't see them either. So how is it helpful to even be thinking about those categories of primary and secondary, and doing the work of thinking, where are the processes, where are the responses, what are the resolutions? That to me is the meat of the revitalization work that we do, because so it's easy to identify what we should and should not do, but what we do with those shoulds is the piece that really needs some deep thought. And I think that some of these thinkers, and even Hart, who I want to chuck across the room sometimes, is really helpful to even just lay out frameworks for engaging with that. So that was the gift to me today, and when I learned about Hart again, or when I was thinking about Hart again. I don't know, Tara, do you have any other thoughts or questions? Or
No, I'm really interested in the and sort of what you're talking about, Rundle, and the relationship, and in the practice, that in those spaces, that in the process, right, in the relationality, in the process, in the practice, that's of course where we find them. And I think that's helpful, or that we find new ways of thinking about law in particular. But I think that those are really good insights and reminders for students as well, picking this up sort of for the first time, that idea of, yes, we're not going to read it and then prescribe that these things get layered on top of Indigenous law or anything like that, that it's really about distilling what we can from those theorists, which also then implicates us in relation to it, right? Now suddenly there's a relationality between us and the text and the theory. So I'm going to sit with that for a little bit.
We were having sometimes I say things that are so smart, and then I hear them, and then my kids report back to me that the words that I said are very different than the words I thought I said, and sometimes precisely the opposite. At which point I want to say things like, "You're supposed to be listening to what I meant and not what I said." The reason I say this is, as I'm thinking about the theorists, sometimes I remember they're the same. And Val pointed out, Hart has written many things. So if you go into a text and you're trying to figure out who they are or what they mean on the basis of a single text, it's the following problem. We've all got these big brain bags of thought, right, that we're carrying around, and there's stuff that's swishing all around there. And then we have this one hole, and the stuff is going to come out, but it's all connected to this other stuff. So even as these texts come out, sometimes it's not exactly what the person thinks. It's an attempt to get to a certain piece, and it's connected to the other thoughts. So this goes back to the judging versus tasting. Like what comes out is one string in an ongoing conversation of material that's going to spill out. So you can evaluate, you can critique, you can work with, you need to do all those things, not uncritical. But if you have that stance on it, it's easier not to fling Hart across the room, but to carry him gently and put him over there. And it makes it easier to say things like, oh yeah, there's Hart with his little blindness. What problem is he looking at? And how can his problem then help me think about a relationship to my problem now? It gives you more distance to engage in ways that will be meaningful for you.
Yeah, and I think that's, I had an artist friend once tell me, because, I'd finished something or they'd finished something, that when they approach art, they sort of, whenever they see somebody's finished product, they assume that it's not exactly, right? We can never, that's a whole nother philosophical
theory question.
Yeah, just perfection, Aristotelian, Plato, right? But so it's like, but it doesn't exist exactly like that. So when he looks at art, he always assumes, and that's one of the things he really enjoys doing, is being in relationship with the art from the perspective of, I wonder, like, where else could this have gone? Or asking the artist, what are the things that are missing from this that you would have liked to include it, or what things turned out differently, or whatever it is. So sort of, and we don't, at least I don't approach art immediately intending to be mad at it or to throw it across the room, right? But certainly with other things I might. So yeah, it's a good reminder.
I think that if you think about some of the challenges and questions within the work that people are trying to do on the ground now, like the Wet'suwet'en, the Giks, and others, insofar as governance, insofar as rebuilding their own institutions, and so on, the ideas about that are important within Fuller's legalities and Hart's framework, they're really important. So for instance, one of the things that is problematic sometimes is where I hear people talking about Indigenous relationships, that Indigenous peoples are relational, that we relate to everything in the world, yada, yada, yada. There's healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. And what's the language that we might use to to interrogate what we mean by relationships. And so, I mean, you can pull some of the stuff from Fuller, like to understand transparency, to understand that you have to have a role when something affects you, that those in authority have responsibilities to you. Like you can take the basic ideas and look at, well, how do they relate to Indigenous governance, right? Because we have to do that. We have to create tools that everyday people can apply to their own experiences and to the world that exercises so much control over their lives. People need tools with which to understand and engage with the relations of power.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for that. Do either of you have any final thoughts for these students as they start engaging in this journey? We sure appreciate all the time and all the ideas, provocations that you've initiated in this video. Rebecca, you have any final words of wisdom?
I think, remember, for me, I love it when people go in remembering that theory is such a gift, it's such a joy. And if you think of this as not mastering the texts, but as like mastery of your own self and your ability to think deeply and richly around the world, this is to have time to spend with each other with texts and theory. Think of yourself as theorists. Think of yourself as doing the work of theory as a tasting joyful buffet of happiness.
That sounds delicious.
Well, there's some real consequences to not thinking, to not theorizing, and we don't have to look very far to see examples of that. And quite a few years ago, I was part of a conversation with folks in South Africa about the importance of about the trend of anti-intellectualism. And so people there in the post-secondary institutions and government were concerned about the resistance to thinking, to the reliance on, to the setting aside of critical thinking because they had to rebuild the economy, right? So don't think about the economy, just rebuild it. Don't have any critical thoughts because that really gets in the way. They were resisting liberal arts education and everything else that they saw as useless. And so that was part of the tension that was going on there. And what I was saying is that those same tensions are taking place within Indigenous societies. There's the anti-intellectualism, which is a part of neocolonialism and a part of thinking that the market has all the answers, that has been embraced by our communities. Right, so the work is then how do you deal with that? So next week the Wet'suwet'en are continuing to talk about how do we make sure that the MOU, that we're able to engage with that and implement that in a way that reflects our laws, right? So and so then, like for us, for all of us, we need to think about, okay, so what are the kinds of tools that they and others need in order to be able to shape that interface with a world that's oppressive in their own terms, in a way that doesn't further their oppression, right? So what do we need to be able to do that? And thinking, sometimes that's all we've got.
That goes on a t-shirt.
Thinking, sometimes that's
all we've got.
Something with, and we got to have our way with it. That's
thinking, have your way with it.
There are a number of mic drops, I would say, about this conversation that are extraordinary. And lots of food for thought. What do you think, Tara?
I think that's, it's lots. But so thank you very much for not just obviously your time, but your thinking. letting us have our way with your thinking.
Your big brains.
Your big learning brain. Your bags, your big bags of thoughts brain. I can't remember that. You made him anyway, yeah.
The innumerable scales and scores and tasting menus and buffets. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary to have
I
this.
haven't eaten my breakfast yet. That's why so much talk about food.
You're just staring at it on your desk. Yeah.
Next time we'll have a jam session.
Literally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much. Congrats.